Mr. Speaker, I rise to support this amendment to the National Construction Authority Act that has been proposed by Senator Eddie Oketch. And Mr. Speaker, I could be a bit underwhelming because the previous speakers have painted me as an expert on the subject matter. Mr. Speaker, I have had the privilege of leading a climate caucus in this parliament. And Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy that in the month of May, all African legislators will converge here in Nairobi at the Senate for the Interparliamentary Union Conference on managing emissions from methane. Methane is a gas that contributes significantly to global warming, but it has not been addressed properly and scientifically, because every time we speak about methane emissions, we think about pastoralist lifestyles, and we think about cows and camels and goats and the emissions that they make. And so African countries have not really plugged into the conversation on methane, but we want to bring that debate to Nairobi. And so in the middle of May, Mr. Speaker, just after the Africa-France conference, we'll also be having the Interparliamentary Union here at our parliament for a conversation on methane. I'm very happy that Senator Eddie Oketch has brought this amendment to the National Construction Authority Act. And yesterday I asked him, how come the National Construction Authority has not proactively thought about this? Because, Mr. Speaker, the carbon footprint of the construction industry constitutes close to 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The construction industry is one of the biggest emitters. And if you look at the components that are used to do our traditional houses, from cement to steel to the aluminium, and everything else that's used in the construction industry, they are all very carbon intensive. Mr. Speaker, even if you look at the cost of keeping our houses cool, or keeping our houses warm, or keeping our water hot and clean, it is a significant expense, and it has significant impact on carbon emissions. And again, with rapid urbanization, I heard Senator Eddie say that the least urbanizing county is urbanizing at 4%. We are seeing gradual urbanization. We are seeing the government coming up with an affordable housing program that we are putting huge tenements in urban centers that will pull people from the villages to the centers. And with rapid urbanization, the construction industry's contribution of 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions is bound to rise. But it shouldn't rise if we can do the things that Senator Eddie has proposed in this particular amendment. What Senator Eddie is proposing is, first of all, to have mandatory solar system installation zones, and also to amend the schedule so that the fourth schedule can have climate change responsive mechanisms that will be mandatory and that will be considered in construction activities. Mr. Speaker, if we have a pure or a clear strategy on decarbonization of the construction industry, we can learn some lessons from a few countries that are not very far from our neighborhood. Mr. Speaker, we recently visited Namibia and went to a project called the Oshivela project. And we found indigenous Namibians, Africans, producing iron ore using green hydrogen. And by that, they reduced the carbon footprint of traditional iron ore production, which typically uses fossil fuels, significantly. And how do you produce green hydrogen? You split water, because water is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. And how do you split water into hydrogen and oxygen? A simple process called electrolysis. In fact, Mr. Speaker, some of these things we are taught in school. Many of us here studied chemistry all the way to university. But now putting into practice how to separate H2 from O, so that the O water can go into production and the H can be used as an alternative energy source, that is where we fail to get things right. And so, Mr. Speaker, when we went to the Oshivela project, we saw a concept that was being done for the first time in Africa, where the iron ore is mined. Then when the iron ore has been mined and placed in a blast furnace, instead of using the traditional fossil fuels using coal, they use green hydrogen to produce iron pigs. Now, they had certain limitations. that the iron pigs still had to be exported to Europe so that it could be alloyed to produce steel. But there is potential for us to use, I wouldn't even call it cutting-edge technology, because H2O is something that we are taught in school, just to put into practice the things that we learn in school. And that can only be done if we create an environment where innovation is rewarded. We create an environment where there is certainty when it comes to policy. And we create an environment where there are incentives. If some young people from Technical University of Kenya were to decide to put into practice electrolysis and they were able to produce green hydrogen, could we incentivize them? Could we get them away from the clutches of KRA? Could we build some industry around them to enable them and to encourage other people with similar aspirations to do the same? So it is possible to decarbonize the construction industry through innovation. And Namibia has demonstrated that you can use green hydrogen to produce iron, and because iron is one of the biggest components when it comes to the construction industry. Again, in cement production, Mr. Speaker, cement that we buy, and for some years we've been importing cement. And Mr. Speaker, some of the richest men in Africa have become rich because of cement. And that tells you about the construction boom going on across Africa. But cement is also not something that came from heaven, because cement is about mining the clay or the limestone, as they are doing in West Pokot, then grinding it, then putting it into a kiln, then heating it to temperatures of 1,500 degrees centigrade. Then you produce clinker. And then you combine that clinker with gypsum, and you produce cement. And Mr. Speaker, this is why I agreed with some policy pronouncements previously made by the national government, which I hope has been enforced, that there's no reason why you should be importing clinker. We have enough limestone. We have enough clay in this country. Perhaps what we don't have is sufficient energy to light up those furnaces. But there's coal in this country. But as the Oshivela project in Namibia has proven, we can produce green hydrogen. You could imagine if Devki and its plant up there in West Pokot was getting limestone locally and then splitting water which is widely available through electrolysis and using green hydrogen to produce clinker. Perhaps that could reduce the cost of cement, and that would definitely reduce the carbon footprint of the construction industry. Today, 8% of global carbon emissions comes from cement production. Mr. Speaker, you can imagine what we could do, how much we can lower it if we went into innovation and applied some things that have already been done. Aluminium production is the same thing. Why are we importing aluminium? The story is that we do not have sufficient energy to do the processing that is required for aluminium. I don't think that locally in Kenya there is any company that is doing aluminium right from the raw material to the finished product. But again, using innovation, we can cut down that cost, and aluminium production again contributes to 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Mr. Speaker, Senator Eddy talks of solar zones. Now, in my mind, if this is a responsibility that is going to be given to the national construction industry, I would want the national construction industry, and agree with Senator Eddy when he says that our building code needs to be revised. Our building code needs to be modernized. Those of us who come from black cotton soil areas, Mr. Speaker, if you have to build a house in my village, you must dig 3 meters down, 3 meters through the black cotton soil. And then you start compacting. You start putting steel. You start putting, it is as if you are building a road. At that time, you are probably just building a 2-bedroom house. The foundation itself is more expensive than the structure that is going to come up. Because we are using a building code, I think a British standard, that has not been revised to be fit for purpose. And it is highly inefficient, it is very expensive, and it discourages many people from building. So we would want the National Construction Authority to relook our building codes and ensure that certain things are made mandatory. One of the lowest hanging fruits, Mr. Speaker, is when it comes to water conservation. And Senator Eddy has proposed that under the 4th schedule, water conservation can be one of those things that NCA must look at. A lot of us here are wasting water from the roof. This country, and if you live in Nairobi, there is sufficient rainfall that if we were able to store the water that comes from our roofs, then we'll never have a problem of water shortage. And it happens in many areas. You find a school has been built with a lot of iron sheet roofs, but not a single gutter, not a single tank. And when you go there as a Mheshimiwa, you are told, Mheshimiwa, help us to get water. And you can clearly see the potential of harvesting rainwater. In Namibia, again, a country that rarely experiences rain, Mr. Speaker, even though rainwater harvesting is not mandatory, it is part of their DNA, that you are not going to build anything without putting a gutter. And sometimes I wonder if you have the money to roof your house, the money to wall your house, and the money to furnish your house, the money for guttering and putting a tank should be the least. And you have seen, we as politicians, those people who want to run against us, some of the campaigns they do is to walk around and giving out water tanks as if it is rocket science. Mr. Speaker, I believe that in public institutions and even private institutions and even affordable housing projects, no rainwater should be allowed to go to waste. It should be captured, it should be put in tanks, and it should be used and perhaps cleaned up because it will provide a fairly cheap and clean source of water for those establishments. So rainwater harvesting and grey water recycling is something that NCA must insist on when making approvals. Mr. Speaker, Senator Eddie Oketch has also said that NCA must look at issues of energy efficiency. You may have noticed that if you go to a hot town like Mombasa, there are certain hotels that are very cool, and there are certain hotels that are very hot, that you must use air conditioning. And Mr. Speaker, I usually find it interesting. Why is it that in this hotel you can sleep without AC, and in this other one, you must have the AC on? And you'll notice that the ones where you must have AC on, there's lots of concrete, lots of glass, lots of steel, lots of aluminium, things that absorb heat and make the rooms hot. But you go to certain hotels, and that's why a place like Lamu, it has got a unique architecture. You can find a house without air conditioning, but it is fairly cooler than the modern houses. How do we ensure that we implement or we come up with building plans and building designs that minimize the use of modern cooling? In our case, it's cooling. In other countries, it's about heating. I think in Europe, heating is a big problem, such that when the war between Russia and Ukraine broke out, the biggest issue was how Europe was going to survive winter if Russia was not going to supply the gas required for heating. But in our area, it is about cooling. Can we ensure that our designs and our architecture and our projects are done in such a way that we can take advantage of natural wind flows, vegetation, and all that, so that we reduce the emissions that come from cooling technologies? If you go to places where the AC is mandatory, sometimes you feel sorry for the owners of the establishment, because you find an apartment with 10 ACs, and they have to be on throughout the day, throughout your stay. You can imagine the kind of emissions that is. So if we can have a building code and we can have designs that take advantage of natural circumstances for natural cooling, I think that will go a long way in demonstrating our leadership as a climate champion across Africa. Mr. Speaker, sustainability of materials used in construction. As I'd illustrated earlier, cement, steel, aluminium, and all those other components, and the big trucks that are used to deliver cement to site, contribute very highly to global greenhouse gas emissions. But if NCA could insist on the use of recycled, renewable, and locally sourced materials, and minimizing waste through efficient design and construction practices. Mr. Speaker, these are things that any plan that is sent to NCA for approval must meet. These are standards that a building plan application must meet. And I don't think that this would in any way impose any additional cost on developers, because it's just about being innovative. It's just about being ingenious. Because some developers just pick building plans from the 1950s, and it's the same thing that they want to be approved today. If you go to some urban centers across this country, you know there's a traditional way that shops were being built by the Indian merchants. If you go to like Vihiga, Maseno, even parts of Kisumu, places like Kindu Bay, places like Homa Bay. There's just one structure where there's a huge facade, and then there's a long go down behind the building, and it's been the plan from the 1930s to date. The people doing building plans must be innovative, and they must start thinking about aspects of climate. Mr. Speaker, incorporation of green spaces and natural buffers. I do recall we visited Russia at some point in the last parliament. And Mr. Speaker, what surprised us was that Kenya's ambassador to Russia, or is it High Commissioner to Russia, was living in an apartment, not the way they live in gated estates in Muthaiga and Runda. Our ambassador was living in an apartment, but that apartment looked like a 1-acre property, because it's an apartment of the 40th floor, but it has gardens, it has grass, it has trees. It is possible. This concrete jungle that we're building in Nairobi, we must insist that we incorporate green spaces and natural buffers in every project that we do. Mr. Speaker, it's possible to do that even on the 50th floor, on the 60th floor of buildings, and that has been proven in countries such as Russia. Finally, Mr. Speaker, Senator Eddy has also indicated that NCA must look at issues of pollution control, whether developers are putting in place measures to reduce air, water, and soil pollution through construction. Mr. Speaker, asbestos has been outlawed in this country, but it's still there. Actually, in most of the old schools, national schools, the big old schools, asbestos is still there. And Mr. Speaker, we need to ensure, perhaps through the national government CDF, which as contentious as it is, but the reality is that it's still going on, that no NGCDF fund should exist for more than 3 years and still you have asbestos roofs in that constituency. Mr. Speaker, it's a mockery, because instead of going to build a new school somewhere, and yet your best school there, for example, in Homa Bay County, Homa Bay High School, one of the best, finest, oldest schools, you still find asbestos roofs. That should be the priority before opening a new dormitory or before opening a new library somewhere there, because the lifelong effects of having asbestos lingering around our children is too high. But, Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, it is possible for a home to warm itself, to cool itself, to be sustainable as far as water is concerned, and even to feed itself. A home can feed itself by tapping into water, rain harvesting. A home can feed itself by using that water to set up a small garden. A home can cool itself through innovative construction and innovative architecture. A home can heat itself through innovation. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that if we upgrade our building code, perhaps we'll shave off 30% of the current cost that we are incurring, and we'll also be able to shave off at least 30% of our current emissions coming from the construction industry. We must continue supporting innovation. And Mr. Speaker, I want to challenge that even as we look at the future of this country, let us be leaders in words, not just in words. Let us be leaders in deed and do some of the things that small neighboring countries like Namibia are doing. Our children can produce green hydrogen, and that can be a substitute to the fossil fuel, and that can place us squarely on that road to climate leadership. I know currently most of our energy is from geo, and it is green, but it is inadequate. Mr. Speaker, an economy like ours cannot run on 3 gigs of electricity. And the barriers have been policy uncertainty. Policy keeps shifting. Fiscal policy keeps shifting. Incentives keep shifting. Mr. Speaker, I support this amendment, and I encourage Senator Eddy to ensure that this matter quickly goes through the National Assembly so that it can be assented to by the President, so that by the time when we are doing the Conference of Parties on Climate Change in Ethiopia, that will be COP32, we can go there and proudly say that we pushed legislation that added to the climate response measures in Kenya. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Olekina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, very briefly,